Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Knowledge Group webcast, Reducing Costs and Services of Supplies to Drive New Profits. I'm Sal Giangrasso, your moderator for today's event. We're going to hand over to our speaker in just a moment. If you're applying for continuing education credit, this is mandatory, serving as your proof of attendance required by state bars and boards. Now, I'm going to be reading 3 secret words at random times today. And attendees, you'll need to make a note of these and enter them into that survey as your proof of attendance. Now, before we start, I want to thank our sponsor, Strategic Source. Their information is on screen now. And I also want to extend our thanks to our speaker, Doug Austin, for his support in preparation for this event. And of course, a huge thank you to our attendees for tuning into Be That Live or on demand. So let's introduce today's speaker. Doug Austin is founder and CEO of Strategic Source. Doug is the founder of and CEO of Strategic Source and Expense Edge, the leading providers of spend management services, strategies, spend mapping sources, process improvement and audit for retail, education, hospitality service, and manufacturing markets. Now, Doug, to advance your slides, remember, all you need to do is to say next slide when you're ready, and we will be moving the slides for you. And if for some reason you might want to jump ahead or perhaps maybe go back and review something on a previous slide, all you need to do is give us the slide number you want to go to, and our tech will take you there. So slide number 9 is on screen now, and we're going to turn it over to you, Doug. Whenever you're ready, please begin.
Thank you very much. I'm Doug Austin, founder and CEO of Strategic Source. We're going to talk about something that's pretty important today. A lot of organizations right now coming out of COVID are struggling to achieve profitability. Sales may be slow, expenses may be high, and that's really our focus is as a spend management company is to help organizations reduce the cost of services and supplies. We all know that those services and supplies cost anything that we can cut there will drop to the bottom line as profit. So we've got a lot of material to cover. I would remind everybody that at the end, we're offering to provide a number of tools. So hang on to the end of the presentation. We'll cover any questions, and then we'll identify the tools that we can make available to you today. So next slide, please. The webinar overview. Organizations are under significant pressure to preserve cash and reduce costs. We're the leader in spend management services and expertise, and we're going to share that with you today. Next slide. We are a Minnesota-based company. We've been in this space for a little over 20 years. We've got experience in about 130 expense categories. We really, as Sal mentioned on the front end, we do the following to help our clients. We do spend planning. We do data extraction and coding. We help with spend assessments and benchmarking, sourcing, supplier management, audits, and then we also have a certified supplier network. Next slide. What we'll cover today, really 5 primary areas. The new untapped profit opportunity, will reveal that. Expense audit and revenue options, building your objectives and your plan, executing that plan, and then finally proving it out and measuring results. Next slide. So spend management, if you look at this wheel, is really comprised of 6 pieces. At the 12 o'clock slot, we do spend analysis. Then number 2, spend planning. Number 3 is sourcing. Number 4 is implementation. 5 is management. And 6 is audit. Most organizations are going to have to do this. They're doing it today in some form or fashion, but that's what spend management is. You know, purchasing departments over the years typically take on this responsibility, but oftentimes they don't get involved on the spend management side on the front end. And that's where we're a little bit different. Next slide. How you'll benefit from today? Well, we're gonna help your organization understand their expense reduction, profit improvement opportunities. This will ultimately help you folks save time. It'll help you improve efficiencies and ultimately reduce supplier risk and improve control, which is something we all want. Next slide. So let's talk about the new untapped profit opportunities. Next slide. If you look at this chart, we're showing here 4 different revenue bands: a $10 million company, 25, 50, and 100 million. We know that that most organizations are going to spend 5% of sales and more on services and supplies. So you can see there that a $10 million company will spend $500,000 on services and supplies. $25 million company will spend 1.2, and so forth. If you our historical averages in cost reductions for our clients are around 25%. So if I use just a conservative number of 20%, you can see that the bottom line impact is 100,000, 250, 500, up to $1 million for an organization that takes this seriously. And keep in mind that those cost savings all flow to the bottom line. Next slide. This is a list of spend management best practices. I'm not going to go through it all today, but there are 15 areas, from the purchasing structure to the spend management data to how you audit suppliers. And one of the things that we do in every engagement on the front end is to try to understand how our clients stack up in those spend management best practices. This is something that we can provide to you at the end of the webinar. If you're interested, just let us know and we can provide that. But what we're trying to do is make sure that we understand the strengths, opportunities, and weaknesses within each organization so we can plug the gaps, do kind of a gap analysis. Next slide. When somebody takes that best practice analysis, we can then chart that. And this is an example of what that looks like. So anything in green is pretty much good to go. Anything in orange might need to be tweaked a little bit, and anything in red needs to be improved. So that simple best practice assessment, when graphed, can provide a 2-page overview to most of your organizations to tell you where you need to focus, whether it's purchasing policies or 3-way match when you're paying invoices or setting the right objectives. So I'd highly encourage you, if you're unsure about your best practices in place today, get in touch with us and we can help you with this tool. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about why spend management is important and what does that look like if a spend management group is effective, and what does it look like if you're ineffective? Well, from a mission and scope, an effective spend management group is going to control up to 130 expense categories. An ineffective group is going to control 4 or 5 or 6. So we want to control as many expense categories as we can. From a cost and profit impact, total spend management can be reduced by 20–25%. From a visibility and a plan, we want to make sure we have a sourcing plan. We want to understand spend by suppliers and by expense category. On the financial side, we want to achieve long-term pricing, least total cost. We're not interested in short spot buy, short pricing opportunities, but we want to do this once, put it to bed, and then move on to another category. On the category strategies, we want to focus on high impact items and processes, not necessarily just on price, but the total cost of the transaction, the business terms, the inventory implications, and so forth. From a supplier selection standpoint, we want to have a narrow corporate directed supply base as opposed to a local, broad, and uncontrolled supply base. Again, on the supplier side, we want narrow suppliers, high performing, versus broad with no controls. On the process and control side, we want purchasing policies in place so that our employees and associates know what they can do and what they can't do. We want to improve controls and reduce risk. On the audit side, we want to plan compliance audits. We want to make sure that suppliers are in compliance with price and terms, and that our employees are using the right suppliers. And then finally, on the resource side, we want to make sure our people are highly trained and they have the category expertise. So that's what an effective spend management strategy looks like. Unfortunately, many groups are on the ineffective side And those are the things that we can help you get under control. Next slide. The benefits of an effective spend management strategy. Let's walk through those. Well, from a profit impact, I mean, the opportunity is really 15 to 25% of your spend. And again, those savings all drop to the bottom line. On the supplier side, managing a supply base is expensive. So to the extent that we can optimize that supply base, we'll have fewer suppliers and we'll reduce costs there as well. On the invoice side, we'll have fewer invoices and we'll reduce our back office costs that is required to support those suppliers. On the compliance side, price and term compliance is measured, giving management peace of mind, knowing that we're in control and that we're using the right suppliers, products, and pricing. From a price protection standpoint, we know, an effective strategy says we should go after long-term pricing, which is going to yield long-term cost savings. Business terms, we want to make sure that we quote, negotiate terms to reduce our costs. And on the process side, there are a number of processes that have to be considered in any expense category. We want internal and payment processes that are designed to. So those are some of the benefits. It's we're talking about financial benefits, but certainly internal efficiency as well. Next slide. So section 2, what are some of those expense, audit, and revenue opportunities? We're going to cover some of those categories because my guess is it's broader than you think it might be. Next slide. This is kind of a busy list, but it's a list of 72 expense categories that most organizations will use, meaning they're spending money in these categories, whether you're a for-profit, nonprofit organization. Chances are you're spending money in these 72 categories, from advertising to first aid to office supplies to uniform and laundry programs. Next slide. If you own your own building or if it is your responsibility to manage facilities, well, now you can consider here's another 15 categories that you're going to have to manage, from carpet cleaning to janitorial services to supplies to window washing. So these are the two most common groups of expense categories that most organizations are going to have to manage. So now we're up to about 87 between the first list and this list. Next slide. These are examples of different vertical markets and expense categories that are unique to those. There's a section there if you're a school or an education provider, if you're retail, if you're in hospitality. And the way you think about this is the first two charts that we just looked at, the general categories and the facility categories, then you step into your vertical market and add those categories to it. That becomes your scope. Next slide. If you're an automotive, truck, or RV dealer, here's another group of slides that, or group of expense categories rather, that you're also going to have to consider. So next slide. And these are, again, some other expense categories. I guess I've repeated retail, LTL, trucking, and manufacturing. I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is the expense structure in most organizations is probably broader than you think it is. Next slide.
Before we get to the next slide, if we could just break in here and give the first of our 3 secret words. Secret word number 1 is analysis. ANALYSIS, analysis is secret word number 1. So if you're an attendee seeking continuing education credit, very good idea right now to jot down analysis as secret word number 1. And let's return now to Doug.
Good, thank you. So this slide shows audit and recovery and consulting categories. So in addition to managing expense categories, there's also opportunities to recover dollars from suppliers that you already paid. You may have overpaid on transportation, your FedEx and UPS charges. You may have overpaid on healthcare, sales tax, telecom, utilities, and so forth. So there are a number of opportunities there to manage, to try to get those overpayments back. And then there's a number of consulting categories too that you might consider, depending on your organization, that can help you with tax advantages or overpayments or just strategies in general. Next slide. So I think what we just looked at in section 2 was scope. How big is this, and what do you need to consider as you're building a plan for your organization? Now, section 3, we're going to talk about building objectives and a sourcing plan. Next slide. I like to implement the SMART objective strategy. And I'm sure many of you have heard that before, but SMART is simply an acronym for a way to set up and build objectives. So objectives need to be specific. Based on the first S, they need to be written in very specific terms. Number 2, they need to be measurable. The objective needs to be attainable. It needs to be action-oriented. It needs to be results-oriented, meaning it has to occur because of something you've done rather than something that just happens on its own. And lastly, it needs to be time-phased. So when we write an objective in the spend management space, it needs to meet the criteria of the SMART objectives outlined here. Next slide. So some of the areas you might consider setting objectives around is cost reduction. Obviously, price over price reductions. That's the most common. But the other ones is how many categories that you quote or renegotiate. You might set an objective around that. You might set one around the size of your supply base. I saw an organization just a few weeks ago that had 30,000 suppliers in their system, yet they only managed 200 categories. Now that's a ratio of 150 suppliers to every one category. It's just way out of control. Now that is not the norm, that's the exception, but that's how bad an out of control purchasing process and supply base can get. It becomes very costly on the back end. You might want to set an objective about paying your suppliers with credit cards because that's more efficient and you get cash back. Or audits, or set an objective about achieving volume rebates. Another one could be around making sure that your employees are using the right suppliers. And then finally, maybe an objective around standardization. So there are a number of areas that you can drive benefit to your organization. These are some of the objectives you might want to consider. Next slide. So here's an example. We take the SMART objectives, and I've just put one in here. We're going to reduce, so reduce is being specific, our supply base by 25%. That's measurable. That's a measurable criteria over our current levels. We have 403 suppliers in our system right now. Again, that's measurable. By implementing, well, we know that's attainable. The preferred supplier program, that's the result. No later than December 31, 2020, that's the time phase. So this is a case of an objective that is written using that SMART criteria and would be very applicable. So it's important to set objectives on the front end of these initiatives so that we know where we were and where we ended up at the end of the time period. Next slide. With objectives set, once we set those objectives, now we start to look at our spend map and develop that data. We need to understand who we're spending with, what we're spending on, who the suppliers are. So at a high level, there's really 5 steps in developing that spend map. 1 is to extract the data. Step 2 is to code the suppliers. 3 is to total that all up. 4 is to populate the spend map. And 5 is to enhance that spend map. And I'll show you what that looks like and how we go through that. Advance. Next slide. This is just another chart that says, if you look on the far left over here, you'll see that we're trying to, step 1 is generate that data. Step 2, again, is combine it, clean it, and code it. And then step 3 is really to aggregate it. So that's what we're trying to achieve. And we'll show you the output of that in just a minute. Next slide. So this is, I'm sure, is very difficult for you to see, but if you look on the left-hand side, there is a category description. This is an alpha spend map. So all the expense categories that are in your organization are populated in that third column here. And then we've got various other data sets in here. On the far right that you see in yellow is actually the supplier count. We found that number of suppliers in each expense category, which says to me that these folks are pretty tactical. They're not strategic because they've got way too many suppliers. You can see the spend, the organization spend right next to that. And then you can see that we've inserted some category savings estimates, and we can articulate and quantify what those are. But this is an alpha spend map. Every organization should have this. You're spending 5% of your total sales dollars on supplies and services. You need to know where that money is going, how much that money is, and how many suppliers that you have. Next slide. The next thing we do with that data is that it's in an Excel chart. We simply flip it around and sort it differently. And we said, in this case, show me the expense categories from largest expense to smallest. Now, the reason we do this is that we want to be able to focus our time on the biggest opportunities, not the smallest ones. So I don't want to devote a lot of my sourcing team's time to sourcing water bottles when I should be focused maybe on telecom or my information systems. That's where the big opportunities are. So we build this chart in dollar descending order, and then sitting down with the client, we say, okay, client, what do you want us to focus on? And in this case, we highlighted everything in yellow that the client wanted to attack, and which, next slide, forms the basis of the plan. Now what you see here in green is the sourcing plan. It's everything that we have covered with the client. The client says, yep, this is what we want to attack. And this becomes the basis of the sourcing plan for the next year or 2 years. Now, in this particular case, this organization had about 100 expense categories. We can't do them all at once, but we need to have some organized, methodical way to attack those categories if we expect to get anything done. This is the start of that process. So we can set this up in any order that we need to, but this in essence becomes the plan that the sourcing department should follow. And it's in a very prioritized fashion. And I think we have a pretty good idea based on the data inside of this, what the benefit will be to the organization at the end of this process. Next slide. So what we just covered in section 3 was setting our objectives and then building the sourcing plan. In section 2, we talked about what the scope of all those categories could be. Section 3 was about building the plan. Now we're going to talk about executing the plan.
And we will do that right after secret word number 2. I will build a little suspense here. Secret word number 2 is cost. C-O-S-T, cost, is the second of our 3 secret words. So good idea. Jot it down so you're on the road to getting your credit. Cost is secret word number 2. I'm sorry for the interruption, Doug, but it's back to you.
Okay. So in section 4 now, we're going to talk about executing that plan. I think before we do that, we just need to be clear what that sourcing process looks like in most organizations. This process is applicable whether you're sourcing office supplies or credit card processing services or even HVAC maintenance. This process is very applicable to any sourcing. So step 1 is we need to understand the business requirements and the strategy. What is it that we want to buy? What is it that we need to buy? Step 2, we need to source the suppliers and qualify them. Do we have a supplier that can meet the objectives that we outlined in the business requirements in step 1? Step 3, we need to develop that RFQ and then go out to quote. Step 4, we get those quotes back, we analyze the quotes, and then we negotiate with the clients. We can negotiate, and we should negotiate. If it's not a bid, we have every right to negotiate pricing terms in a quote process. In a bid, we don't have that flexibility. So step 4 is very important. We want to negotiate with suppliers, and we want to zero in on the high cost items within that RFQ. Step 5, we want to develop that solution and come to a conclusion. Of the 4 vendors that we quoted with, which one or 2 do we think are the best choices based on our business requirements? Step 6 is we want to recommend our solution to the management team, whoever that might be, whoever you report to, or whoever's reporting to you. We want a solution with options. What do those options look like? And then based on the decisions that are made, we want to notify the suppliers and be very courteous and professional and say, thank you for your participation, you won the business. Or thank you for your participation, you did not win, but we'd like you to participate the next time we come around and do this. Step 7 is we now want to implement that solution. And then step 8 is we need to manage the supplier, audit that supplier, and then report back to management. So again, that 8-step sourcing process is applicable to virtually any expense category in any organization, whether it's profit, for-profit, nonprofit, or government. Next slide. This is an example of price benchmarking. Again, I know it's difficult to see, and I've shortened the example here, but we do this all the time. In fact, we've got between 12 and 15,000 price benchmarks in our system, from office supplies to shop supplies to credit card processing to credit bureau reporting, you name it, we have it. But what's important in any quote application or quoting and analysis is that you compare the previous price to the new price, and that's all we're doing here. These are different areas that I'm just showing you, but the first group is uniforms, the second one is office supplies and shop supplies, lubricants, janitorial, printed forms, and waste. Again, this is a compressed version, but it shows how you can consider your last price paid to your current price, calculate the difference. That's the hard dollar savings. And then when you multiply that by consumption, or forecasted consumption, you can very easily estimate an annual cost savings. Next slide. This is just another example. Same thing, price benchmarking. Last price paid to new price, calculate the dollar difference, calculate the percent difference. When you go through this, you're going to find in some cases you're hitting it out of the park. You're hitting doubles, triples, and home runs in some items, but you're also going to find when those quotes come back that you've got a lot of opportunities. And again, research says there's a group out there called the Aberdeen Group, says that if you don't centralize purchasing, you're probably going to spend 25% too much. That has been our experience. We did 2,000 sourcing projects last year, and we ended up generating an average savings of 27% for our clients. Why that's important is it kind of backs up what the research says. Research says centralize and save 25. We help our clients centralize, and we're at 27. Next slide. I'm going to get into a little bit of detail for you so that you have some takeaways today. So I'm going to cover just a handful of expense categories here that might be useful. We're an operations group. We're very focused on helping our clients cut costs. So a lot of the information we have is data. But this chart shows that if you're a $50 $1 million company, 100 million in sales, what your likely spend will be, what the savings target should be in the office supply category, what your savings should generate to your bottom line, and then some other aspects. If you look to the, in terms of strategies that you might want to consider, if you look to the left side of the page, this is the advice that we're giving you. Get a usage report from your vendor, build an RFQ, quote and analyze the results, determine 200 high usage items that your company is using, and those become your core items. Those are the ones you want to zero in on. You want to finalize that analysis, negotiate a discount list on everything else with your supplier that maybe you don't buy as often, but you still want discounts. Then you want to advise the suppliers, thank them for their participation, and implement. So that's the strategy. And, you know, so my advice to you, if you look at your office supply category, is target 16%. You ought to be able to achieve that. That's what we achieve in terms of cost reduction in that category. Next slide. If your company uses a uniform or laundry company for uniforms, your target there ought to be right around 15%. That has been the typical results that we are able to get here. Again, if you look at the top, there are different revenue bands and suggested probably what you're spending based on the benchmarks that we have for companies of that size. And then in red, you can see what the savings target should be if you attack that category. If you look off to the left, our recommendations: review your contract end dates. 2, attempt to renegotiate if you're more than 50% through your agreement. So if you've got a 3-month agreement, you're in month 19 or month 20, if you suggest to your supplier that you want to renegotiate, chances are they might say yes. Now, they're under no obligation to do that, but they're smart. They're trying to protect their revenue, and it might give you an opportunity to go in and tighten up prices once you do some benchmarking. So number 3, finalize with new prices if you're renegotiating. Or number 4, quote with suppliers to get some other competitive quotes. 5, finalize your analysis. 6, make a decision. 7, advise your suppliers and thank them. And then 8, implement. So that's a strategy that you can lay out on your uniform program. Again, if you look over the chart on the bottom in terms of other strategies, you might be able to pull in some sort of volume rebate. There are a number of other things that you can do in addition to just focusing on the price of a shirt or a pair of pants or a rug or a mop. Next slide. Now we're going to move into another service, credit card processing. This is an industry that's undergoing a lot of change and a lot of opportunity right now. We are suggesting that your target savings opportunity ought to be about 10%. We show some spend based on revenue bands in here. There are a number of companies out there today that are offering discounted cash strategies. And what that means is, and I'm sure many of you have seen this, that if you go into a store now, you might pay a price if you pay by cash, but if you use a credit card, you may have to pay a slightly higher price. What the merchant or the vendor is doing is passing on that credit card fee to you. So that's another opportunity is to look at if your company or organization is serious about cutting costs. Well, we can do it 2 ways. One is use a traditional method and just go out for quote and negotiate and try to cut our costs that way. The second opportunity might be using that discounted cash strategy where you pass the credit card fees back on to the buyer. So the recommendations in this group is review your contract end dates, attempt to renegotiate, finalize with new prices, quote if you want to do that, and then finalize, make the decision, advise suppliers, and implement. There's a lot of opportunities around merchant processing right now, so I'd highly encourage you to to consider this. Next slide. Waste and recycling. Most every organization has waste containers and recycling containers. If you look at our data there, your target should be 20%, or is it, I believe it was 26%, I'm sorry. You can see in red what the savings opportunity might be if you're at that revenue band. And again, strategies on the bottom of that chart, and off to the left, the recommendations. So not too different from the other categories that we've considered here, but this is kind of the process that you can go through for the waste and recycling category. Next slide. Janitorial supplies. Again, here's another one with some live data. It shows that the opportunity would be around 16%. It shows what the savings opportunities would be. Again, strategies at the bottom of that matrix, and the advice or recommendations off to the left. And I just want to reinforce this. Getting a usage report from your supplier or suppliers is going to give you a lot of intelligence in terms of where you're spending your money and how much it's costing you. So those usage reports, if you get them in Excel, can then be flipped around to help you build, excuse me, an RFQ that you use to go out to quote. So that usage report can be a very valuable tool if you get it in Excel. It can form the basis of your RFQ for all future quoting. Next slide. So we've covered a lot of ground. We're kind of on third base here and getting ready to come home. We've talked about understanding the importance of spend management. We've talked about understanding the scope, building our objectives and building our plan. We've talked about executing the plan. And now we want to talk about, in the last section here, is validating the savings and measuring results. Because at the end of the day, this is what we're after. We just need to go through 4 steps on the front end to make this happen. Next slide. This is a version of the scorecard that we covered earlier, but the scorecard and the spend map, if you will, are one and the same. We can use it. We can use that tool to record any cost savings that we have validated as a tracking device. So this just shows how we can take that spend map and turn it into a scorecard using the same document and be very efficient about it. We can plan our categories and we can track the results as well. Next slide. If off to the left here, you notice, again, we can turn that spend map into a very intelligent document, a smart spend map, if you will. We can put dates that the category contracts are up and when we need to work them. We can assign personnel to that particular category. There is just a number of things that we can do using a smart spend map. It will be your sourcing plan, your scorecard. It will become your management plan, your work plan. Next slide. This is an example again. If you look to the right-hand side, where we can even track supply-based reductions. We can track audits that we've completed and audit results. So what seemed like a fairly innocuous document on the front end, a spend map, an alpha spend map, can turn into a very comprehensive management tool on the back end if we employ the right strategy and if we insert the right data. And this is what we can help you do if you use our services. Next slide, please. Again, this is implementation tracking. Did we implement the category? How many audits have we done? What kind of results are we tracking? Again, so turning that spend map, that sourcing plan, into a smart spend map. Next slide. So again, the benefits of spend management. What we're trying to achieve. Well, first and foremost is measurable are dollar cost reductions. Those dollars are going to flow to the bottom line. We're going to try to get a significant supply base reduction to make our organization more efficient and reduce our costs. We're going to try to get fixed pricing for 12 months or more. We don't want to get pricing that's good for 90 days or 120 days. We want to attack that category, get it right, and then move on to attack other categories so that we can stack up the cost savings. Number 4, we want to get auditable pricing in business terms. Why? Because we can create peace of mind for the management team. That's a benefit. If we can establish those prices and get everybody on the same page. Number 5, we want to standardize supplies and services to reduce cost. Number 6, we want to get visibility to what we're consuming. How many batteries are we consuming? How many boxes of gloves are we consuming? Once we have a narrower supply base and have visibility to what we consume, then we can manage more effectively. Number 7, we want to have purchasing controls and approvals so that we've got a controlled process out here. We're not going to fall victim to scam vendors that are calling in and selling us toner at 3 and 4 times the going rate to an unsuspecting employee. And then number 8, we want to get online access to suppliers and pricing and contracts. This stuff, what we're trying to do is simplify the complex. And it's very easy to do if we're willing to take the steps and organize and organize around those precepts. Next slide. So an executive summary. There are opportunities out here to reduce costs and improve profitability. And typically you want to think of 25% of your spend as the target. Again, most companies are going to spend 4 to 5% of total annual sales on supplies and services. I've seen a heavy trucking company that spend as much as 45% of sales on supplies and services. So again, we are being very conservative. Your typical scope, again, is going to be 60 to 130 categories to manage. You're going to need short-term and long-term sustainable savings to enhance your profitability. I mean, we want to get long-term pricing commitments. We don't necessarily want to get into a contract, but we do want to get long-term pricing commitments from our suppliers. We've given you 5 categories today and opportunities that you might want to consider right away. But really now is the time to get started. We've given you kind of a good overview of what that spend consists of in terms of categories and how you attack it, how you set up objectives, how you develop your spend map, how you then execute the plan, and then how you measure results. So now is the time to get started. Next slide. So our mission, Strategic Source, is really three companies. We help our clients really in 3 ways. We want to help them reduce costs, want to help them save time, and improve profitability. And we've got a range of solutions. Strategic Source is really our primary business. It is heavily consultative, but we provide guarantees in all of our solutions that can range up to from 2 to 1 to 10 to 1. We will guarantee results in those engagements. Expense Edge is a SaaS model. It's a portal-based model for folks that might have a purchasing department but don't have the data. They don't have the time to go out and do the quote. So we can give you the data, we can give you the benchmarks, and then you can take it from there. And finally, Strategic Source Learning. If you are trying to develop the capabilities of your team to do what we do in Strategic Source, well, we can teach you that. We've got 3 learning modules that are pretty comprehensive that will take you through the development of a spend map, again, the setting of objectives, all the way through sourcing, execution, and management. So we can help you in those 3 ways. Full service, software as a service, and learning. Next slide. We for those of you that are on the webinar today or may listen to it later, if you'd like an estimate of the cost savings potential at your company, simply send us an email. Send us an email at sales@strategicsource.com. With a little bit of information, we can send you a customized savings report. And this is going to be based on your spend, but based on a lot of benchmarks that we have. And I just reviewed our spend benchmarks 3 days ago, early this week, for 2021. And we've got a robust group of benchmarks that can help you. So if you're looking for a simple estimate of what cost savings might be available to your company, reach out to us at sales@strategicsource.com. Next slide. Remember when we first started this webinar 46 minutes ago, I showed you the best practice checklist. Well, we can make that available to you as well. So if you are interested in that, if you would like to see that, a more legible version, we can send that to you. And then if you complete the data, we can graph it to you and, spend 10 minutes on the phone kind of walking through what it means. But if you are unsure of whether you got all the controls and processes and policies in place for your organization, then I'd encourage you to reach out. Again, sales@strategicsource.com. We will provide the benchmark tool, the assessment. You complete it, and then we'll graph it for you. Next slide. Again, our full service spend management solutions will start at $16,260. We have guarantees attached to every one of these. So we will guarantee a positive ROI. If you're looking for somebody that can do all of this for you, we're the company. We're leaders in spend management. We're very good at this. And we don't know it all, but we're learning all the time, and we apply that learning certainly to our customers. Next slide. The Expense Edge solution that we have right now, this is, look at this as a purchasing department for small to medium-sized businesses. We can put an annual subscription in place for less than $1,400 per location, where you'll have the data, you'll have solutions that are ready to go out of the box, and sourcing tools, access to webinars. This is just an outstanding program, and there is nobody in the industry doing this today. So if you're interested in a quick overview of what Expense Edge can do, again, shoot us an email at sales@strategicsource.com, and we'd be happy to give you an overview on that. Next slide. So there's for the materials, you can either go to sales@strategicsource.com. You can or email Chelsea O'Connor, C.O'Connor@Strategic Source. She can help you. And then I'm listed there below, my phone number. And then Chris Austin is listed there as well. So if you've got questions, our phone numbers are there. Our emails are there. So you've got a number of contacts. I'd really encourage you, we've covered a lot of ground here today. And but most companies, if you're not taking a serious look at your spend management, most companies are going to have opportunities with an upside of around 25%. So reach out to us. We're happy to help. We're not going to high pressure sales you. We're willing to consult and give you the best advice that we can. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, I guess that's it.
Yeah, Doug, thank you so much. Doug Austin, excellent job, very relatable, very interesting to listen to you, Doug. He's the founder and CEO of Strategic Source and Expense Edge. And Doug, we're going to get to some questions. And if you would like to submit a question, you can use the Q&A tab in the chat window, right-hand side of your screen. And we're going to answer as many of these questions as we can in the order they are received. So, Doug, we're going to turn to questions momentarily, but right now I'd like to offer the third and final of today's secret words. Secret word number 3 is profit. Profit. Profit is secret word number 3. So now you have all of them, and you're going to need all 3 for the survey we'll be sending you after the event. Fill out the survey with the secret words, submit it, and you're on the road to getting your continuing education credit. And thank you all for your attention to the secret words. Okay, Doug, we have some questions for you here. Typically, how much time does it take to build a spend map and sourcing plan?
You know, good question. It really, the data that is needed to come out of a typical financial system can be generated by a simple report. It could take as little as 15 minutes by a good controller or finance exec. And then once you get that data and you start coding it, that's where the lion's share of the work is going to come from. But that might take a couple of days, maybe 16 man hours. But the output is going to be very valuable. That spend map will become the roadmap, if you will, for the organization in terms of everything that they're going to attack and source. So I'd highly encourage everybody to do that.
You know, as I was listening to this, I would guess each company is its own individual case in putting this together. But how does it factor in if a company has maybe one expense that, because of a long-term commitment, may be a little too high? How does that factor in as you are building this new spending map and sourcing plan?
Well, that's a good question. So one of the things that we try to do is, as I showed you, and I know I covered a lot of slides there, but when we build that spend map, if we put contract end dates into the left-hand side of that spend map, we can analyze that pretty quickly. And again, the suppliers are under no obligation to renegotiate with you. But if you're more than halfway through a contract, in most cases, and reach out to a supplier and say that you want to renegotiate, oftentimes they'll say yes. And they're doing it selfishly because they're trying to protect their revenue stream. So again, they're under no obligation to do that. But if you're more than midway through an agreement, it wouldn't hurt. Once you have some benchmarks in hand, it wouldn't hurt to contact them and say, look, we really like what you're doing, but we need to focus our organization on cost control. And most suppliers will understand that. That's something that everybody is dealing with today, and they might be willing to renegotiate.
You know, Doug, these strategies really do make a lot of sense. So why aren't more companies or organizations using this suggested approach already?
Well, a lot of companies try to sell their way to profitability. So instead of focusing on bottom line on operations, they focus on selling more widgets, more cars, more furniture, and hoping that they'll hit their profitability targets that way. And that works. I mean, it works for a lot of companies. But, a more effective approach is to attack your top line and your bottom line simultaneously. Do it in parallel. Most purchasing departments are very tactical and transactional, meaning they're focused on cutting a PO, they're focused on getting inventory in the door to keep the production line moving or keeping people satisfied, but they're not focused on the strategic aspects of the buy. And that's why it's important to build that spend map, to have a strategic perspective, then attack those categories in a methodical, prioritized way, and focus on the strategic elements of the purchase. What am I buying? What am I buying most often? What are the big drivers of cost in this category, and how do I reduce them? So once you get out of that tactical, transactional mindset, then you can start to drive real value, real cost savings to the bottom line.
Doug, I think we have time for one more question. So as we wrap this up, what are the biggest expense category cost-saving opportunities out there today?
Yeah, it's going to be different for every industry, so I'm going to try to outline what I think would be applicable to this audience. I would say take a look at telecom. Telecom with voice over internet. VoIP is a opportunity. The technology is changing all the time. That's a category that can oftentimes yield 30 to 35%. Uniform and laundry services can be 16 to 20%. Office supplies is kind of innocuous. Everybody uses it, but if you get a good usage report, you can oftentimes take 15 to 20% out. And in some cases, you can even get signing bonuses from office supply companies that if your spend is large enough, they're willing to cut you a check just for doing business with them. And the last one that I'll mention is one that, again, every organization, either a for-profit or a nonprofit, will have to contend with, is your merchant processing, your credit card services. Very competitive. There are a lot of players out there. The rates can be highly competitive, and there's a different strategy that you might want to employ too. Instead of the traditional merchant approach where you pay the fees, maybe you adopt the new strategy where the buyer pays the credit card fees and receives a discount for cash up front, or they absorb the cost of those credit card fees. So there's 4 ideas that might be applicable right away.
Well, thank you so much, and that's just about all the time we have, but I do once again want to thank our speaker, Doug Austin, for assistance preparing for this event. And if you're applying for continuing education credit today, this survey is mandatory, and you will need to enter those secret words as your proof of attendance. The link is also being posted in the event's chat now, and you can be accessing it via the event homepage too. Now, if you can't find the email, it may have been sent to your junk mail, but feel free to get in touch if there are any questions. Certificates you've earned will be sent via email and can be viewed on your account page on our website or the app. Finally, you can follow us across social media. The Knowledge Group is on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Follow us for all the latest news and event information. You can also hear what our speakers are going to cover at future webcasts on our Knowledge Group podcast, found on both iTunes and SoundCloud. And this now concludes our webcast, Reducing Costs of Services and Supplies to Drive New Profits. If you have a question we maybe didn't have time for, you can reach out to our speaker directly with the information on screen now or within your materials. And if you can't find those, or maybe you have a question for us, just send an email. The address you need is info@theknowledgegroup.org.